Make sure you never miss an FX Medicine episode by subscribing to us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Hi, and welcome to FX Medicine, where we bring you the latest in evidence-based integrative, functional and complementary medicine. I'm Dr. Michelle Woolhouse, and with us today is Dr. Veronique Chachay, researcher and lecturer of nutritional science at the University of Queensland. She's here to discuss the research around fasting, longevity and optimal metabolic health. Welcome to FX Medicine, Veronique.
Good morning, Michelle. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for being here. So I wanted to start off our conversation today. It seems there are a lot of diet and lifestyle-based health trends these days that are hugely popular, things like the paleo diet, barefoot running, earthing. But one of the ones that I've found the most convincing and most intriguing, kind of from an evolutionary nutritional perspective, is that of short-term intermittent fasting. Veronique, can you start us off by talking through what you define as fasting? Like, what do we mean when we say the word fasting?
Yes, very good question, because it's important when we talk about health benefits, expected or targeted. We need to put that in the framework of what pattern of fasting we're talking about, and because there is a thin line between fasting practices and then eating disorders, if you see as well, yeah. So fasting, as you mentioned in your introduction, is not new. It's been probably something that the human physiology has practiced because of the way the food supply was having ups and downs throughout the year, for example, where we go through periods of abundance food supply and then periods where it was a little bit less and sometimes much, much less. So that forced pattern of abundance, or what we would call feasting and fasting, that forced pattern has been there throughout all humankind up until nowadays, where we have 100% of abundance all year round. So now also from a religious point of view, so as you know, there is a number of practices as well there, which with different pattern, with different purposes. And often if I had an interest in looking at, where did this all originate, it's also more from a mental training point of view, because it's about being able to control one's, urge to overeat or to eat. Anyway, so because of that, there's been these observations. So in certain population where the fasting is a regular religious practice, that there seem to be less chronic disease, for example. Really? Or maybe at the end of so you would recall there was this study, the Geosphere study, where people were under a big bubble, a glass bubble, where they lived for 18 months, where just looking at self-sustainability, so growing their own food and etc. Now, out of that, they had issues in the sustainability aspect of it. So they were actually deprived of food or of the normal supply that one would need. And so at the end of it, they had lost a fair bit of weight, but also had a number, and we're not talking people who necessarily needed to lose weight, right? So it was not for the purpose of weight loss, but there were metabolic benefits of this period of time. And so that was really the start of saying, okay, what's happening during fasting here? I mean, is it just a matter of losing weight? And then, of course, as we know, losing weight induces so many metabolic benefits by itself, right? And so I guess the most popular would have been obviously the 5-2 diet that Dr. Michael Mosley has investigated by his own purpose with that documentary. I think it was 2012. I think it came out, where he went to actually interview different scientists who research in the field of calorie restriction, which means putting animals on a restriction of a certain amount of energy that compared to what they would need, and then see what happens, and also looking at the clinical aspect. So what came out of that is that there is a definite benefit of reducing, basically putting the body under mild stress. So a calorie restriction is perceived as a stress, and then as a result, so, in same principle of the hormesis theory, where we put a little bit of stress and that induces or activates all the genes that are about resilience, about defense, about detoxification, and so on. And so the calorie restriction on optimal nutrition, the cronies, so that's a movement that exists worldwide, where people willingly, by choice, not just through a period of 3 weeks or anything, but like as a lifestyle, reduce anything between 25 to 40% of their estimated energy requirement based on, weight, physical activity, basically anthropometrics that we use to estimate energy requirement. And they do that as a lifestyle.
Do they do that all the time, or they do that intermittently, or do they do that at certain parts?
So that is on a permanent basis. So the calorie restriction on, but the key thing here is calorie restriction on optimal nutrition. So they don't
they don't have tiramisu for dessert.
Just have chocolate bars through the day. It's about having optimal nutrition in terms of micronutrients. And so they do that. And so the aim here is to increase what we would call health span and potentially as well lifespan, because that's what's been observed in the mice models of calorie restriction, right? So, but that is coming with benefits, but we don't have really those evidence in terms of the lifespan of a human being because we don't have those studies and we can't conduct those studies. However, if there is some studies reporting on biological age similar people, but those who calorie restrict as a lifestyle versus those who just eat, normally. And so comparing, individuals at 45, 55, 75, and looking at the actual physiological age and showing that there appears to be definitely health benefits of calorie restriction in that sense.
So what are they looking for when they're looking for that benefit? Are they looking at metabolic factors? Are they looking at...
Yes, so metabolic factors such as the typical kind of disease that would develop over time when we have, an abundant diet of all sorts with gradually more sedentary lifestyle is things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, for example, which actually is called, I just realized now, is called MAFLD, metabolic.
Yeah, that's right.
It's interesting. Metabolic fatty liver disease. So, for example, this, or in that same line of thought, the body composition, so composition of fat mass versus lean body mass. Things like balance, the test that on 1 foot balance, closed eyes and so on, reflex response, and like a speed of reflex. So this kind of general what we attribute to normal aging, so the aging effect. Normal aging affects those functions. And so comparing that with calorie restriction practitioners, there seem to be a maintenance of sort of more youthful metabolic markers of that sense. Now, with this, though, the big discussion is, is it suitable for everybody? Is it a sustainable way of living? So, yes, in certain environments it's doable, but in others it's not so practical to do that. And then, is it suitable for everybody? So there is evidence that it is, that it's very, again, that thin line to go towards eating disorder behaviors, That has brought a bit concern, shall we say. And so this is how then looking at the benefit of those restrictions, but doing it in an intermittent way, started to come up as a potential. So, and also I must say, I think the intermittent fasting research has been also motivated by the observation of the shift workers who do intermittent, but in the other way around.
Yeah.
And because if they work at nighttime, the food supply is not maybe the same, so they tend then to go also for other types of macronutrient distribution and types of food, which then associates or brings association with metabolic dysregulation later on. But that observation of that shift work, which completely puts everything upside down, was another source of information saying that perhaps that calorie restriction, as in an intermittent way, could be useful. So now you've got there's lots of different wording, like you said, from the popular press and some different wording for it, but you could call that periodic fasting, where you, within a 7-day window, where you've got either 2 consecutive or distributed days of fasting. And It doesn't mean that it needs to be 0 intake. It can be just, like a certain percentage, or maybe 0 to 25% of usual intake.
Michael Mosley's, advice is to have 500 calories for women and 600 for men. So that's around probably
25. That would be 25%. 25%. Then there is what we will call the time restricted eating, or TRE, or time restricted feeding, and so this would be within a 24-hour cycle, where we've got a feeding window, anything between 8 to 10 hours perhaps, or depending, you can do it more or less strict, and then the rest is fasting, as in proper fully fasting then.
So you're fasting for 14 to 16 hours, is that around?
Yeah. So some people push it even further, but that is, again, why does one do that, and what are the, what's behind them?
Is there benefits?
But I mean, that would be about the 8 to 10. So with this time-restricted feeding brings in that chronobiology aspect of it, that it is better to feed during the day or during the waking hours, like even daylight signaling, because of all this internal regulation through the clock genes that, about the chronobiology, dictating when things happen. So when is there upregulating of genes, when there is downregulation of genes expression. And so to feed at the time when we are more likely to express the genes, for example, to produce enzymes in digestion, for example, then it obviously makes sense to have that during the day as opposed to the middle of the night.
That's so fascinating, that chronobiology. I love that term, they're having that circadian kind of regulation. It makes so much sense,
and there is,
to do that.
There is the translation of that is then to go into chrononutrition, they call it even now. That's very popular term. But I mean...
Well, I know that when I studied Vietnamese medicine, so it's like Chinese medicine, but from Vietnam, they would often talk about various different organs of the day having their kind of ideal time, with the gut and the liver, almost being switched on overnight around that kind of midnight to 3 a.m. So this idea of kind of chrononutrition or chronobiology is obviously the ancients or the traditional practitioners have known about this for a long time.
Yes, which is really interesting, and this is why I share the interest in that field as well as with you. From a dietitian point of view, to study all the different nutrition or diet therapies around the world from different backgrounds, to then understand why do they say that we should have a very light meal at night time, more eating during the day, and so on. All these things. And there is not necessarily a biochemical explanation because the knowledge was not on that level at that time, but there was some intuitive knowledge, definitely. And fasting comes into that it is... even animals like to fast when they're not feeling well, or when so there is this element where why should we have a feeding regimen that is dictated by cultural habits or by the timing of the day? Oh, it's 12 o'clock, I need to eat. No, it's not that. It should be, I'm hungry, I need to eat, and that's it. But anyway, so then we're talking about also... So we had time-restricted feeding, which is the time period thing. Then we had the periodic fasting, which could be those 2 days over a 7-day window, 7-day 2 days either consecutively or alternating. You could have the alternate day fasting, which is so ADF is a short for that. So we're talking 1 day on, 1 day off, 1 day off, but all the time. And that is more commonly done just by reducing the calorie intake on the fasting
So
days.
is that down to sort of that 500, 600, or are they doing more the 800 fasting?
From the literature, I have from 0 to 20, up to 25% of calorie intake or something. And then there would be those long-term fasting, which is so as you know, when people go and that would be under medical supervision, where there is a much longer window of
so they
fasting.
might go for like 5 days or 7 or even longer than that.
So there is little evidence on that.
Right. So we're including all of the nutrients and we're sort of taking away the calories, but making sure that the nutrients and micronutrients are all catered for.
So, Well, with that's why I say under the long-term fasting, it would need to be under medical. I mean, it's hard to talk about it in terms of evidence, because I can send you literature and even documentaries which talk about those. We call them the health sanitarium, I think, in Germany and in Russia, where they practice the long fasting. So this is just water fasting, like purely water fasting. So we're talking up to 3-4 weeks, but under medical supervision, and they're getting vitamin supply as well and mineral supply. And that is to address things like, arthritic conditions, even diabetes and so on. But we're talking, that would be more, I put
that'd
this
be more
under
disease
therapy.
focused.
And therapy definitely. Then we need to mention also, in the intention of making all this more palatable, if I can say, more something that people are likely to take on as a health habit for again long-term. So we're talking about the health span, extending that duration of life where we are healthy. There is all these different protocols that I have flourished, and some of them are more or less well founded. But I need to cite the calorie. Sorry, it's called the fasting-mimicking diet from the research group from Walter Longo in UCLA, and so. Walter Longo is one of the, so he's researching in the field of gerontology, which is, understanding the aging process and how can we address that early on so it doesn't get to the geriatric state. And so he studied a long time ago with animals, and even looking at the benefit of fasting in conjunction of cancer therapy, but that is another topic. We can talk about it differently. So talking about this as being an adjuvant to, during chemotherapy, but it's a different field. But anyway, so he researched that a lot. And then he also looked at more the metabolic markers such as insulin growth factor 1, so IGF-1, and what are the IGF-1 levels, how they are associated with health or disease, and noticing that with fasting we are able to lower those IGF-1 levels. Now, I need to put this into, it's all cautionary here, because IGF-1 levels are very important at certain time of life, and they're perhaps not as important later on in life is the system, because it's a growth factor, right? So
that's right.
When we are young, we want it plenty, but in growing.
Because it works hand in hand with growth hormone, yeah?
Exactly, yeah.
So it's great when we're growing, but we don't want so much when we grow older, because we're not growing so much that's going to grow things that we don't want to grow, like something like cancer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I was just in preparation of today, I was reading a review about, just actually from that group, recent, I think published this year, to looking at what are the optimal level of IGF-1, and it seems it's a bit like one of those J-curve.
That's right.
And so too little is not good as well, even for older people. It's not good to have too little.
So you want it in that sweet spot.
It's about it's about modulating that does. And so dietary factors are involved in IGF-1 production. For example, we know that high insulin or elevated insulin levels in the blood will drive the production of IGF-1 in the liver. So why do we have high insulin? Well, we would get raised insulin when we consume a lot of carbohydrate or, excessive sugar all the time. I mean, insulin is super important, so we don't want to bag insulin. But it's about becoming maybe insulin resistant with aging. So that means we have a little bit of more elevated insulin.
And the statistics on insulin resistance is enormous. I mean, we've got, huge percentages of the world population now showing levels of insulin resistance. So, I mean, this is a really common issue where fasting may become like a way, to approach it that might suit people.
To modulate that, yes. Because
that's right.
So, because by modulating, restoring normal insulin function, then we don't have this signaling to produce more IGF-1. So that's one of the things. And also, according to this group, it's, the branch chain amino acids. So we've got 20 amino acids that we use from our diet. Some are essential, some are non-essential. Non-essential meaning that the body can make them itself. But the essential have to come from the diet, and some of them are those branch chain amino acids. So there's 3 in particular. And they seem to promote as well, more or less indirectly, the IGF-1 production. So with this in mind, this group has developed a protocol called the fasting-mimicking diet.
Right.
And so it's a proprietary program, with all sorts of little
secret ingredients
and vitamins and all this kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes.
And it's an interesting one. So it's a 5-day program where you drop the energy intake from, so I'm talking calories here, from a normal, 2.5, 3,000 for men or 2,000 to 2.5 for women. You're dropping to, not excessively, to 1,000. But there is a definite breakdown of macronutrients, so protein, carbohydrate, and fats. And then, so that's for 1 day, and then for 5 days it drops a bit further to 900. So it's not excessive, but it's again breaking down the macronutrients in a specific way. And the aim here is to promote the. So I don't know if we want to talk about this now, but it's when one of the mediator of all the fasting benefits, or one of them, I should say, is the ketone body beta-hydroxybutyrate. So as we are switching from, if we start fasting like today, so what we're going to do, we're going to first use whatever carbohydrate store we have in the body, and that is in the form of glycogen. So liver glycogen will be broken down, so it becomes sugar, again, glucose, which is then released into the bloodstream, and that still sort of becomes the first sort of source of energy for cells. Now, why do we use glucose? Because it's a lot quickly utilized and turned into fuel that cells can actually use, right? And then in the muscle glycogen, so that doesn't contribute to blood glucose, but it's used locally for muscle. Now, once this is depleted, there is no more stores, then gradually, I mean, not just suddenly, but gradually, progressively, the body starts to break down fat stores a lot more. And so here, when we break down our fat stores, what we end up having is not just a trickling. What's the word? A little flow. We don't get just a little flow of gradual energy. Yeah, that's it. not gradual. But when we break down fatty acids, it's a huge. It's like the hose is turned on really, really large. And so it's like we have the molecules to produce energy in much larger quantity. And so much larger than what we actually need. And so there is a way to deal with this large amount of molecules, and that is to convert them to what we call ketone bodies. So some of it will be used to produce that energy that the cell uses. Some of it will be diverted to ketone bodies. So it's basically having an intermediate sort of packaging of this extra molecule. Now, these ketone bodies, so there's 3 of them. The one that circulates that can be measured is beta hydroxybutyrate, or BHB, and this beta hydroxybutyrate is then taken to other tissues. So that conversion happens in the liver, right? So then it's taken to all sorts of tissues, so to muscle, to the heart, to the brain. And at these tissues or at these locations, the cells are able to use the ketone bodies to then produce that fuel that they need. Right. So in other words, it's actually a new fuel. And what is now being studied, so for the last 5-6 years, it's really, really apparent, is this beta hydroxybutyrate. Not only it is a fuel, but it is also what we call a signaling molecule, something that is going to induce or activate pathways within the cell that make the cell being able to detoxify better, to regenerate, to dampen inflammatory pathways, and so there is a definite molecular benefit for that, you know.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see that we've got this ancient kind of practice, you know, that has got some spiritual aspects and some, you know, very significant biological kind of aspects that, you know, we're now finding, I guess, the mechanism to explain that we've got these chemicals that we can make inside our cells that actually activate pathways to help us detoxify, regenerate, and de-inflame a cell. And when we look at the, you know, chronic disease crisis that we're in, let alone a viral crisis of a pandemic, but we've got another crisis which has been going on for 40 or 50 years, this chronic disease issue, and we now know that it's due to subclinical inflammation. We've now got a way to understand that by doing something like a intermittent fasting or periodic fasting or this fasting-mimicking diet, that we may have a way in which to ameliorate this subacute chronic inflammation that is creating chaos, really, across the world, really. It's not just Western world. It's across the world with westernized and highly processed diets, which is just
absolutely
fascinating.
It's like an inborn mechanism in a way. It's part of the, and it's somehow, I mean, without crossing the line here, but it's almost giving some credit to, you know, those more traditional ways of looking at healing that says, fasting can make you feel better. Fasting can heal yourself. So I mean, obviously, it's a big statement, but there may be some truth just because of that mechanism, for example.
I think there's a lot of wisdom to be learnt from traditional societies. I mean, we can talk about, you know, my views, I guess, of their ability to kind of tune in and be present and to really understand nuance is so much more than we can in this fast-paced world as well.
Yeah. Yes.
The other mechanism that I always think is really, really interesting is the role that I've read about intermittent fasting and or time-restricted eating on really simple things like cholesterol and triglycerides. So, you know, do we have enough clinical evidence to sort of say, you know, we've all had in our clinics patients that, you know, we've tried, I guess, Mediterranean diet and, you know, their cholesterol still remains high or the triglycerides still remain high or they're unable, I'm thinking of one patient in particular, you know, who we just couldn't get those triglycerides down, and she found she was a Mediterranean woman, so she was on a Mediterranean diet anyway. But when we started introducing fasting as an option for her, she did lose a significant amount of weight and her cholesterol did return to a much better health
level.
So have we got some research to show that this is a particular impact on time-restricted eating or periodic fasting, for example?
If anything you were talking about cholesterol, so if anything, I was reading a paper that is just about to get published. And so that was in a population, in an older population. So we're talking about like 55 and over, shall we say, but mainly the majority being over 65. And so in this particular case, what they were looking is the extended fast. So the extended nightly fast, we're going to call it. So less than 10 hours or 10 to 12 or more than 12 hours.
Right.
And in this particular case, they found that it was not beneficial for their population because the HDL, so the high-density lipoprotein cholesterol, the one that we would
the good cholesterol,
associate with good cholesterol, yes. So that was actually being lower in those people. And then the potassium was much higher and the chloride was lower, I think, from memory. So now, when I see a study like this, I'm like, okay, this, especially as a dietitian, I'm like, what are the confounding factors? And again, we need to remember that these studies, and any studies that are working under the the gold standard of our evidence. So how we rate evidence is obviously the highest level of evidence is a systematic review of a randomized controlled trials where people are basically randomized to this or to that, or if we're doing an intervention, or classified simply, like in this particular case, that would have been a cross-sectional study where there's no intervention. It's just looking at what, a snapshot on a given point. And so we need to remember by doing that, we are completely neglecting individual response, right? So if I go back to the randomized controlled trials, by randomizing randomly, we basically flick of a coin, we may have responders and non-responders in both groups. So you put people on fasting and those alternating their fasting, for example, and you put the others on just not fasting and see what happens. But what we completely neglecting here is the different genes, for example, in the apolipoprotein. So, the protein that is characteristic to each lipoprotein, so either HDL, LDL, VDL. So there's now well-recognized different variants in those apolipoproteins that then make somebody, for example, so it's another topic. We can have a conversation about this if you want to, on nutritional genomics and so on. But I have in mind a very specific study where with a certain variant of the ApoA1, I think it was, that people were doing worse on a Mediterranean diet, which was high in monounsaturated fatty acids, was actually exacerbating their metabolic syndrome. So when we say Mediterranean diet, everybody should use extra virgin olive oil and it's just the best, etc. But if we've got that genetic sort of print underneath that is slightly variant, so it's not about bad or good, it's about having a different variant, and it's common to have those variants, right? So it's about understanding well, maybe that's not the best for me. It's better, maybe something else. I'm not suggesting they should go for butter, but, it's maybe not as much MUFA, monounsaturated fatty acid, perhaps less.
So I think Walter Longo was talking about that when he was sort of saying, like, we just simply don't have the breadth of research to say that everybody should fast or that fasting for 12 hours is exactly what we need to do, or 16 hours is exactly the one. And we're probably never going to get that because of just the way that our research says, like, some people it definitely suits. You've got these anecdotal 103-year-olds that says, yes, I've been fasting intermittently for the last 60 years and I'm so well. And so that's exactly what everybody should be doing it, but everybody doesn't necessarily respond in the same way.
No, not in the same way. And so I think that really goes well with the study I was citing before, the IGF-1, looking at that, what is a good dose. So I think that was from the Longo group, and I think they came up with something like between 120, what is it nanogram per mil, to 160. That was, where there was the best association with health and less all-cause mortality, but too little and too high was no good for. So if we look at that, if that is describing a spectrum of effect on many different, it was a huge study it was a meta-analysis, I should rephrase, where they looked at 19 different studies, so a very, very large, and looking at all-cause mortality and correlating that with the IGF-1 levels. And so here we go, 30,000 individuals. And so it could be that J curve or that window where it's the optimal, even 120 to 160 nanogram per mil is still quite a range. So it could be that the response is again individual and depends on that genetic makeup to start with.
Yeah.
And we talk about personalized nutrition, so that's really but that's been going on for the last 10 years now. Personalized nutrition is the future of nutrition and so on. But that supposes that we are able in clinical practice to not just test for 5 or 6 genes like some industry companies offer us, like those, let's test your gene, and they give you like 10 or 15 maximum and things like to have variant on the enzyme that metabolizes coffee, for example. But that is not enough to give proper prescription for dietary intake. You don't just do on 10 to 15 genes. You need to do it on much, much larger. And then we need to understand what is the gene-to-gene interactions as well, and the gene-to-gene variant interactions. And on top of it, if you want to make it more confusing, and we have to now because we know the knowledge about the role of the microbiota, so we need to bring that layer as well, because our microbiota profile we know in terms of carbohydrate, for example, make us respond differently to the amount of carbohydrate we're consuming and the type of carbohydrate. So it used to be, low GI, high GI, and that's the best way to monitor your blood sugar level. But the Israeli study, which I'm sure you're aware of, where they monitored people, a large population, they monitored with, those every 5 minutes blood glucose monitor attached to, and then getting them to monitor everything, poo samples and activity, sleep pattern, and so on, and get them to eat all sorts of different foods. And where you would think that they would have a low glycemic response, some had a high glycemic response, and vice versa. And so it throws out of the window all those one-size-fits-all kind of recommendation that we come across.
Does.
So does it mean we can't do anything? Because until we've got this technology to be able to do one blood test and we know everything, it's going to be a while, right? And until all clinicians are trained for that as well, it will be a while. Does it mean that we should do nothing in between? No, it doesn't mean that. It means that we can try to go for trial and error. And practicing fasting in those circumstances, like alternating day or time-restricted eating, for example, that is not going to cause harm to the person, right?
Yeah.
So the evidence is there now. It doesn't. The fear was, for example, that it was going to reduce muscle mass, not just fat mass, and the evidence is now coming. No, it's fine. Muscle mass actually gets protected for some reasons when we do it this way. Not when you're doing 15 days of fasting. I'm talking about the alternate. So there is also the evidence coming through that people thought, as soon as you can eat all what you want the next day, people are going to binge. And no, the evidence is actually that people naturally tend to consume less on their normal eating day. Not because they're trying to, because there's no restriction, but just naturally they tend to do that.
Surely this would shift our appetite genes, our leptin and our ghrelin.
As well. Yes.
As well. We're talking about how it shifts insulin and insulin-like growth factor. It's going to, those flow-on effects of sort of appetite suppression and satiety and even the mental aspects that we'll talk about.
The mental aspect is a key one, indeed, So we know, for example, again, that ketone body, beta-hydroxybutyrate, has an appetite suppressing effect, so that's another one. And so the mental effect of knowing that, I just need to, try this diet really, this extremely restriction for 3 weeks until I lose my 5 kilograms, and then I'll be fine. Well, there's none of that. And I think that is the biggest breakthrough here when we're talking about weight loss and weight management, is to say, hey, there is a way of eating and behaving with food that is very different to what we've been taught so far. And the thing about we must eat 3 times a day because breakfast is the most important. Well, no, not for everybody. For everybody, it will be a lot easier to skip breakfast and to extend that fast until midday, and then and knowing that this is okay to do so, and then I'm just eating eating until 8 o'clock, and then I won't be eating anymore, and I know that tomorrow I can eat again. So that because, at the end of the day, any weight loss program can potentially make you lose weight. Is doable, right? But the problem is, it's not about the big deal is not about losing the weight. The big deal is to then maintain that weight loss over time and be a healthy individual, so that you have sufficient energy to be active, build muscle mass, and so on. So for a number of people, they love that pattern because it's not as daunting as knowing that for the next 6 months I'm just going to have this really ridiculous amount of food every day, small amounts, and when I go out it's a problem and all this kind of thing. Well, here there's a lot of flexibility. You can just match it according to the schedule.
Yeah, that's right,
well,
and you can change your days as well. I wanted to really kind of hone in. There's two other aspects of the fasting diet that I thought, through our conversation prior to the one we're having today, was super fascinating, and that is the effect on immunity. So there's a lot of research about fasting and the health of the white blood cells. I know you're particularly interested in this. Tell us a little bit about how fasting impacts immunity.
Okay, so this is also from the Walter Longo group, actually, when they did it in their animal studies. And then they also, they've noticed it in the animal studies, and then they tested it in humans as a proof of concept through their fasting-mimicking diet. So it's good because I'll bring back this in because I don't think I've explained that diet very well. But anyway, so what they've noticed is that in the mouse models, so through the practice of fasting, that a certain amount, so it was 30% of the white blood cells were being destroyed in the process, so deprived and of not having substrate, being really under this situation of starvation. So that was inducing those genes of autophagy. Autophagy meaning that it's the cell cleaning itself, so expressing enzymes that basically eat away all the old organelles, but also promoting apoptosis for cells that are too old or too not well functioning or diseased. And that upon refeeding through the stem cells, all those white blood cells were basically, or the production of white blood cells were upregulated, and then to replace the ones that died. And through that principle, the hypothesis was that we know that through the aging process, the autoimmune system becomes less functional, and this is, how we see sometimes autoimmune disease appearing in older age and so on. And so that the hypothesis was, if we can, through those regular fasting periods, through a lifetime, we're actually renewing our immune system on a regular basis, because we're allowing for the old to die out, and then for promoting the upregulation of new white blood cells.
It's almost similar to that beta-hydroxybutyrate, it activates those pathways for sort of detoxification and regeneration, and almost is like working on that regulation of the inflammatory pathways, being our immune system as well. It's just fascinating that different kind of different mechanisms, but ultimately the same sort of simplicity of we need to clean out here, just like we could clean out our cupboards and clean out our houses from time to time,
From time to time, yeah. And so that that autophagy pathway, so autophagy being the process of cleaning the cell, and so upregulating detoxification enzymes, upregulating enzyme that basically digest all the old organelles in the cell. So this process is upregulated by beta-hydroxybutyrate. So that you need the presence of the ketone body for that. And so then how do you produce a ketone body? Well, there's many ways. You basically need to utilize fat stores as a source of energy. Actually, I should rephrase that. Ketone bodies are produced when fat is a principal source of energy. So whether it be our own fat stores, through energy restriction, we end up having to use our fat stores, like I explained before, albeit through a diet where there's not as much carbohydrate, but more of the fat. So this is how, in that particular fasting mimicking diet, it's not completely low carbohydrate like a ketogenic diet. It's just more reduced carbohydrate, but a bit more fat proportionally, right? And so, but it's also, just a parenthesis, it's also how the ketogenic diet aims to explain certain benefits. Or, for example, all those supplements, those MCT oil, so medium-chain triglyceride. So the idea with medium-chain triglycerides is that they are medium-chain, so they're only up to between 6 to 12 carbon long as opposed to 18, 20, 24. And so they, upon intake, so upon absorption in the intestinal tract, they're not taking, normally fat is transported after absorption, is transported through the lymphatic system, through chylomicrons, but short chain and medium chain fatty acids are actually entering the bloodstream straight away in the portal vein, bound to albumin, taken straight away to the liver, and so being basically metabolized much more quicker. And so if we consume these medium chain triglycerides, you've got to handle it to start with because it's not very digestible. But if people, when they take it as a supplement, the aim is to produce the ketone bodies because the liver is going to metabolize it. And if we consume quite a fair bit of it, some of it will be directed to produce those ketone bodies. So anyway, back to the fasting mimicking diet. So what they did then, they tested that in humans to see whether they would also notice the benefits on those white blood cells. So the fasting mimicking diet, like as I explained before, it's like a 5-day protocol. And the idea is to do it for 5 days, then have 1 month normal eating, another 5 days, 1 month normal eating, and another 5 days. So do it 3 times. And they recommend 3 times once a year, in that kind of pattern. So obviously glucose was regulated, ketone bodies, IGF-1 was decreased after so I'm looking at the thing here, after the 3rd cycle, even was very low. So they were measuring after each cycle of 5 days. And then the last measure was done after the end of the 1 month eating normally, right? So 5 days, 1 month full normal eating, 5 days, 1 month normal eating, 5 days, and then normal eating, and they were taking their last measurements through that last month. So in other words, when people were back to normal eating.
Yeah, back to normal, yeah.
Yeah, and so the IGF-1 was still lower than baseline. The IGF-1 binding protein was a little bit upregulated. So the binding protein is the one that holds onto IGF-1, so IGF-1 cannot have that growth hormone effect because it stays bound to the protein in the blood. And then looking at all sorts of body fat, body composition, and so on, and CRP, so as a marker of inflammation, CRP was significantly decreased even on that very last after 1 month, and then it was mesenchymal, the special cells who are there used as stem cells as being then used for. So whether they're being used specifically for the white blood cells is not specified here, but that is what they use as a surrogate marker to show that, and so that was upregulated clearly. We can see that after after the 2nd cycle, and then still after 1 month of eating normal. Yeah.
Even just through this brief conversation, to realise that there is some significant changes in your underlying biochemistry by doing, whether it's time-restricted eating, intermittent fasting, the fasting mimicking diet, those kind of interventions seemingly having some significant biochemistry, long-lasting effects on things like inflammation, immune cell detoxification, regeneration, changing the way that our hormones work, changing our signalling. So really some fascinating areas of research. I mean, I don't think yet we know the fully long-term impacts on longevity, but it seems that, it does have a relationship in some ways, like even using things like body composition, balance, reflex response, issues like fatty liver disease, etc.
And to keep in mind that the ultimate studies that could demonstrate that, they're not doable from a human point of view because we're not rats and we can't be under control. And there's so many other factors that influence
that's right.
our long-term health anyway. However, what you just mentioned here is we these molecules that are responding to fasting, so molecules in those genes and those transcription factors that are responding, that are being activated or suppressed, all these kind of pathways that they are used as surrogate markers. So we are then inferring that if the inflammasome is suppressed, so the NLRP3 is suppressed through beta-hydroxybutyrate, then we know that systemic inflammation is more going to be dampened. And so in the long term, when we know that systemic inflammation interferes with insulin signaling or will be damaging the endothelium of the cardiovascular system and so on. So we can infer that the insulin resistance will not likely take place or less so, and that there is protection on the cardiovascular system. So it's all about inferring based on those observations that are made. And is it good enough? Is it not good enough? Well, we don't know, but you're right. We'll never know for sure, that's for sure.
Veronique, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today to discuss all these facets of intermittent fasting. It just has what feels to me so much potential to affect our health in so many different ways, from gut health to metabolic health to immune health to the effects on brain, the nervous system, and the list goes on. And I think even practitioners who are well versed in this area will have found some clinical pearls to implement in their practices after today's episode. Okay, well, so thank you so much.
I don't know if we covered everything that we should have, but I'm happy to come back if necessary.
Thank you so
because
much.
You're right. I just pick up on the word gut health. So there is often a question, what happens to the gut microbiota when you're fasting, right? Because you suppress. And so the evidence shows that actually the pathogenic bacteria, there is a shift, shall we say, into the composition of the gut bacteria, where the pathogenic bacteria don't have their substrate, so they don't handle that period of fasting, and so they tend to be diminishing. And then when we talk about intermittent fasting, so the alternation, whatever you do, whether it's hourly or weekly, whatever, or day per day, it's the idea of fasting and feasting. And so that switch is, I didn't say that, but that switch is what has been really identified as being the beneficial aspect, because compared to permanent calorie restriction, which we talked about at the start, the permanent calorie restriction doesn't have that switch, okay? It's permanent. And there is the theory that there is some adaptation taking place, and that the body then learns to do with what little it has, and there is no, over a long time, does it really create the same benefit as the alternating. So when we talk about brain health and some in the animal data, there was really brain-derived neurogrowth factor that is promoted also by beta-hydroxybutyrate, by the way. And so that means, protecting having new neural cells, but also protecting the neurons. And so that switch was not so much when it was constant calorie restriction, but a lot more when there was that fasting-feasting cycle. That's something to think about anyway. So here we go.
Amazing.
We can, but it's a pleasure. And anytime, Michelle, if we want to talk again, I'm very happy. All right.
Thanks everyone for listening today. Don't forget that you can find all the show notes, transcripts, and other resources from today's episode on the FX Medicine website. I'm Dr. Michelle Woolhouse, and thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
This podcast is intended as healthcare practitioner education only, and it is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to FX Medicine, and share us with your family, friends, and colleagues.